public without interfering, without screwing around, without doing anything unethical to it. So I think, you know, Pope sort of trains them in that early on.
One other thing, I haven't looked at the contents lately, but that long collection of plays that he published, he's basically collecting things that people don't know about. They may have been published in the court or somewhere in the 17th century. So he's saying, you know, we have, in effect, there are editions of Shakespeare around, some of the other major playwrights, but he's going for a lot of the minor stuff that's fallen through the cracks.
Yeah.
And doing a public service and recovering a body of literature that might fade into oblivion.
Right, yeah. I mean, I haven't studied that collection in depth at all, but I just know that it is described as, I mean, I don't think I exaggerated when I said single-handedly, you know, reached back and recovered these texts that literary history was in danger of losing. They were not being performed anymore. And someone even said that there is really no play that we perform today or teach or whatever that was not either well known in the 18th century or included in Dodsley's book. That's where we get our stuff. Dodsley plus Shakespeare plus a few others. Sharon?
That reminds me of, it just makes me think of the monks, the monasteries copying the classics and preserving them. Otherwise we would not have them. But that the printing, in addition to being the printing as a method of copying, a mechanical method,
tool of preservation.
And indeed copying, because copying these earlier plays.
But of course, to preserve, you have to know which is worthy to preserve. So you have to.
Or what you have, or what you select. I mean, it's the cart and the horse. Which also, when you spoke about the question of the critics, and that a review would just be a lengthy collection of lengthy quotes. The reviewer was sort of silently, the reviewer could guide the fate of the book by selecting the quotes to use.
I'm sure, absolutely.
So in a way, it was still expressing an opinion without hearing it.
Yeah.
If you put in all the worst, boring, most poorly written, you know, no one would buy it. Or if you put in the...
So sometimes most of it act was the Reader's Digest kind of thing. So
Oh, just abridged?
Yeah.
Right.
Just give the whole plot. So you would have to
ruin the story. You don't need to
spoiler coming.
I had a question about what you were talking about with the sort of dangers of pleasure for the pedagogical project, the sort of need for pleasure in order to attract learners, but the dangers for this middle-class audience of pleasure for pleasure's sake. And I was struck in part because that sort of seems like a universal dilemma of people engaged in some kind of pedagogical project, at least in what I work on, which is 19th and 20th century Russia. They have the same sort of concern that sort of useless entertainment would sort of have this danger. But I'm wondering, there were sort of two kinds of anxiety that you mentioned briefly. One about youth as sort of distractible and the difficulty of attracting them, and the other about the middle classes, which this book seems to sort of possibly be, this project was sort of possibly driven by anxiety about middle classes going beyond their sort of professional capacity and attempting to become writers that they are destined to be not able to be, or something like that. So I was just curious if you could talk more about what kind of cultural anxieties there were that might have underlay this sort of project. You mentioned both briefly, and I wasn't sure if they were important or not, or whether one or the other was more important than
Yeah,
some sense of the danger of educating these emerging middle classes in the wrong way or something.
Well, there's a lot of discourse in this period on the danger of reading, and especially novels. I can't look at any of this without thinking about the big market for novels, and I mean, Johnson wrote about this too. About how novels are so seductive. They really get people to identify. They have the power to teach so many lessons, But if it's the wrong lessons, this power is, it's going to wreck lives, it's going to wreck society. I mean, they're really extreme and describe. I mean, it's so much like our video game rhetoric today. The internet, it's rotting our brains. I mean, the anxieties are very similar. So I think there's an attempt to, rein in reading, but at the same time try to use that sort of seductive force in reading. So, later in the century in textbooks I've looked at, you get more and more sort of fictional narratives thrown in there, less essay, because you know that kids want to read that. And it's a change. I mean, so there's the anxiety, but there's also wanting to tap into this power of narrative. But also the anxiety is also too, and also like today, about just the amount of stuff that's out there and how do you weed through it? How do you know what to put? If you haven't inherited your ancestors' library, how do you know what to put in your library to look educated, if not actually be educated? So yeah, both. Class, reading, it's all mixed in there. Amy?
I was wondering if you have thought about the ways that Dogwood's editorial practices might relate back to what he was preaching about the dangers of copying. It just seems really interesting to me that copies fail to capture the individual voice. So rather than creating a digest of what people have said on these various topics, he goes out and he gets individual voices and puts them together and preserves them. And perhaps that links to his need to give them authors as well at times to further.
I think that's a good point. That makes sense. So right, let's just go straight to the sources. But these are not. Not all of them are reprints, so to speak, and not all of them are. There's no classical authors, for example. There's examples from them. They give examples from Shakespeare, examples from classical authors, but it's really scholars that he's going to, scholars and other writers.
So is he interested in the scholars in a little voice then? And kind of saying, here's this authority on elocution, we know he's the best, so we're just going to him. That kind of thing? It's interesting.
Yeah, I don't.
Method that he's using.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that because the voice, there seems to be sort of this separation between scholarship, scholarly writing, and creative writing, which we still have with us today. And that, Shakespeare is a different kind of example than the work of Mason. So I see them more as authorities. He wants to go straight to the authority, and he's creating them as scholarly authorities. Some of which had those reputations, some of which their reputations had been made by Dodsley himself. So.